Along with the 20-year anniversary of the film that has gone down as one of the best superhero movies and franchise sequels of all time, it's also been exactly 2 decades since one of the more influential, revered, and possibly and slightly overrated video games of all time, Halo 2. Oh, and Activision along with Treyarch carried on their duties to Columbia Pictures to deliver on their contractual movie tie-in to Spider-Man 2. But something rather elusive happened that not even the devs could predict back then, and are now looking back at as they got to work on a brand new Spidey game almost 15 years later at a little studio called Insomniac Games. This unlikely movie tie-in game stood the test of time and is practically acclaimed by many as not only one of the best movie tie-in games, not only one of the best superhero games, but also one of the greatest action games of the early aughts period. I don't know, 20 years is a long time, and having cultured a channel dedicated to most things Spidey, it only makes sense for me to sit down, pick up my controller, crack open my GameCube copy, strictly for nostalgic purposes, because then later I would get sad at how expensive and tedious it is to play this on original hardware and get everything hooked up. So I ended up just booting up the Dolphin emulator and see exactly what has aged gracefully and poorly about Spider-Man 2, the movie game. As you make it past the super low-res title screen and input your completely mature name for your save file, the game begins with a cutscene and a giant skip prompt at the bottom. Really wish this button wasn't as sizable, let's say, now looking back. It's also the dead giveaway that you're watching an in-game cutscene using in-game assets, rather than the pre-rendered CG cutscenes sprinkled very scarcely throughout the game. Back in the day, I used to think that the pre-rendered ones were so cool and were directly lifting the CG doubles from the films and putting them directly into the game, while the in-game cutscenes looked a little stiff and tacky. Oh, how the turntables. As 20 years later, I almost think the exact reverse. The resolution of the CG cutscenes remains locked with a forced letterbox effect, thus bringing the quality down and making it all very blurry and smudgy, versus the in-game counterparts which, thanks to the power of emulation, receives a glamorous upgrade. Plus, credit where credit is due in rigging all of these character models to walk, gestate, and at least appear to talk and interact with one another looks pretty genuine and authentic. When the CG characters show up, Jesus Christ! What the hell did they do to Toby? Or at least, what is Toby going to do to me? What's wrong with Mary Jane's face? And what's going on with Otto's hair? I ended up getting engaged more with the consistency of the in-game cinematics, more than the pre-rendered ones, and once I learned to ignore that very fat skip prompt at the bottom, I was pretty locked in the presentation of the game like I was in 2004. Even with the average voice work laid right under it. Most of the VA work here is pretty par for the course as far as movie tie-ins are concerned. You can tell that Toby showed up in the booth for a day or two and kind of cashed his check on the way out, while other seasoned video game actors were given some rather melodramatic direction.
Now about your loan, Mrs. Parker.
Personally, my money's on Spider-Man. What do you think Beck's got this time?
Who knows? He's a little loopy, right? Hollywood types.
But Alfred Molina, harnessing the power of the theater, delivers a rather nuanced performance, and he still nails Doc Ock for the likes of a tie-in movie game. And Kirsten Dunst surprisingly feels more like MJ than she did in the movie. Seriously, there's moments where she feels more lively, charismatic, charming, kind of sexy even, and even funny when speaking to Peter.
Really? Is that all you have to say?
And of course, there's Bruce Campbell, remaining just as smooth, debonair, and groovy as ever while walking us through the opening tutorial and the tips that you can access throughout the city.
Don't just freak out and jam on the grab button in a fight, okay?
Speaking of the Great Apple, New York still feels alive and kicking as Spider-Man 2 broke ground at the time by allowing you to visit the street level of New York, as well as scale and crawl up the walls of the skyscrapers virtually almost everywhere around the island, being able to visit Roosevelt Island via some later story missions, and even giving you access to Liberty Island and the Great Old Statue of Liberty via a helicopter hack, which yes, I tried once again during this latest playthrough. It was even very late in this playthrough that I noticed that the developers managed to pay homage to the now gone World Trade Center. And this is just a few years afterwards. I noticed these lights before, but it was here in this retrospective playthrough that I was like, wow, this was still managed to be included, and it's pretty touching. New York shockingly still feels like a breathing open world in this movie game, despite the reuse of building models, JPEG textures stretched out across doors, windows, and interiors, and character models being literally copied and pasted almost everywhere, almost literally right next to each other from time to time. From the explorable environments to the aforementioned in-game cutscenes. You can see them in the background. You even have some mismatched voice acting when you have a female NPC having a male voice actor behind it.
I'm trying to get away!
Nevertheless, the voice talent for these NPCs still managed to sell the illusion of personality, and interacting with them and hearing them cheer you on or to tell you to get a job exploring the city still has its own unique form of New York charm, if you will. It's even more amusing when you let some of these civilians get their asses kicked by some criminals off in the distance, while leaving the appreciated day and night cycle take its course and the stereotypical early 2000s music kicks in.
Don't hurt me! Whoa! Ah! Whoa! Help! Please stop! No. Stay back! Don't hurt me! Somebody help! Help! Please stop!
But eventually, you are gonna have to get over there and do your superhero duties and save him, I guess, and also take to web swinging. Arguably the star of the show and one of the most talked about mechanics of the game for the past 20 years. It's managed to transcend time. It's been one of the more influential mechanics that almost everyone expects out of a Spidey game regardless of developer. And wouldn't you know, even through an emulator on PC using a different controller, it still came back to me almost instantly, serving as a testament to how intuitive and damn near perfect the devs at Treyarch got the formula of shooting a web, letting go at the right end of the upswing, and shooting another, repeat, and enjoy. And once you get almost every speed upgrade and the slingshot and web zip abilities, I'd go as far as to say it feels just as good, if not maybe at times better, than last year's Insomniac Spider-Man 2. Yes, I'm ready. Give it to me. I have fireproofed my house from the torches after saying that. Though to be fair, a little bit of my muscle memory from playing Insomniac's 2023 sequel did kick in from time to time, like pressing the top face button so I can zip to a bad guy, but resulting in nothing really happening, or trying to cancel my web swing with the rightmost face button, but once again, nothing really happening, and the only way to really do that in this game is to jump off of it, which then resulted in many instances of me either losing momentum or simply just crashing into buildings and disrupting the whole flow. As beneficial as it is moment to moment, the zip web ability doesn't really have as much zip as the more modern video games have, and Insomniac arguably improved on the concept of running up buildings and crawling up walls over the limitations that Treyarch had in place here, having to press a specific button to stick to a wall, or only having a limited amount of traction before your wall run eventually, runs out, and you automatically just bounce off. Nevertheless, keeping the physics of the web swing simple enough is all that's needed to make the mechanic timeless and influential enough to show up in future Spider-Man titles, and makes the notion of a fast travel system or consulting to the minimap much less required, and thank God for that, as having a satisfying web swinging system in place was definitely needed here, especially when those chapter objectives required to complete start to come in a little fast and heavy, leading us to arguably the first element in Spider-Man 2 that hasn't exactly aged too well. This initial would-be crux of their not having a fast travel system in place was easily overlooked since web swinging was awesome and fast travel would have only benefited speedrunners or content creators like me to expedite the process and capture the gameplay. Until the game started to feel just a little slow, a little rudimentary. At first, the amount that you need to allocate is not too daunting, but naturally becomes a little higher and higher as the missions progress, often ending up in the 3,000 to 4,000 range. Though there are some chapters and story objectives that do a good enough job at balancing out the amount of points you get natively by completing some of the story stuff and only having to supply the difference on your own time, There were a handful of chapters in the second act, particularly when we are barely leading up to the birth of Dr. Octopus, that the game sadly feels padded out somewhat, with point acquisition requirements a little too bloated to go unnoticed. Now, points for creativity, slightly pun intended there, go to having these activities offer a good sense of variety, often ranging from stopping criminals to rescuing falling construction workers to taking injured civilians to the hospital, the latter of which I was reminded of when I was playing 2023's Spider-Man 2 and noticed how Insomniac cheekily called back to this mechanic throughout the game. Except the boat missions. These missions. The boat missions. Them. Sorry. 20 years before and 20 years later, these are arguably the worst missions in the entire game. The boat placement, the very faulty, very terrible collision systems of where you can and cannot climb or stand on the boat, then falling to your death in the water. And even though he's able to swim, the civilians practically drowned and dead, and you get a mission fail. These missions, I'm sorry, they're terrible. Moving on. No. Oh, okay. Anyways, purple icons appearing throughout the city signify random events within it that are somewhat timed, often disappearing if you don't tend to them quickly. Most of the time, these are criminals beating up on a dude, or a woman having her purse taken, or a kid losing their balloon and doing their best impression of nails on a chalkboard if you don't stop and bring it back. Of course, the more dynamic ones are going to be the ones where you're actually getting a good sense of combat, traversal, and combination of these two aspects, but I might have a little bit of a spicy take here. They too get just a tad, just a little repetitive towards the latter half of the game. Not only does it not take very long before you see the same armored car getting jacked or the tipster getting threatened into baiting you into an ambush, but I found myself either mashing B to attack or dodging and countering over and over for at least the opening act of the game. So imagine how relief I was to know that I wasn't simply just being blinded by rose-colored glasses when I discovered, or rather rediscovered, the upgrade system. Going into certain buildings, some of which end up either being arcades or comic book shops, appropriately, with a little star indicated on the minimap, leads you to not only the only functioning doors in the city, but also the upgrade system, which I much better appreciated it in this playthrough, as buying new skills, additional combos, web power-ups, and even other abilities desperately broke up the near slight monotony of early game combat, with some of my personal favorites being the tornado kick or hammering bad guys back and forth with a web yank. But despite the progression of the system and buying nearly every upgrade, certain encounters showed their age with clunky collision systems and faulty dodge inputs, leading to many moments when I could have sworn I hit the dodge button and yet a thug still managed to get a punch in and I go ragdolling, which I admit the ragdoll physics in this game for both me and the enemy NPCs are rather timeless and hilarious. But after a while, these green icon activities, even with the upgrades in hand as well as the purple icon random events on the streets, despite feeling a bit more varied due to the upgrade system or the inclusion of new enemy types thanks to certain events in the story or new arch nemesis making their grand entry into the game, they too can't help but feel just a little stale after a while. With the exception of the mech suit guys towards the end of the game, I sincerely do not remember these guys being as tough as they were in this playthrough. Or maybe I'm just getting old and developing skill issues. Still, it was quite satisfying to figure out the strategy of how to beat them, getting them to shoot rockets at each other by lining up their line of fire until the last robo-thug remained. A combat strategy I wish was a bit more present with other enemy types. Some of these new enemies factor into the game after Spidey has his tussles with certain bosses, which I remember being a little more badass than this. I was a little sad to discover that through a new 30-year-old perspective, that Rhino fight, the game's first major boss fight, is really just a huge dodge machine, while fighting Shocker feels more like you're fighting with the camera than anything else, due to how much he leaps all over the map both times that you fight him, the latter of which feels a little stretched out in and of itself due to a arbitrary shield that he has, and you have to wait on Black Cat to shut down. Then there's our main big baddie, Doc Ock, which borrows a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, and even invents his own column C. Dodges tentacles repeatedly, battle the camera because of how much he likes to zip around the environment, and not once but twice you have to shut down a certain amount of generators while avoiding getting zapped by his fusion machine. Yes, very early to mid 2000s video game stuff. Yes, I'm aware of the D-pad functions, such as pressing up on the D-pad to be able to lock down your sights on a target, or down on the D-pad to trigger your Spidey Sense mode, which slows down time to give you the advantage. But even outside of these boss fights, these mechanics were a little cumbersome to manage. These boss segments, while not inherently bad, didn't really hold anything too inspired within them either, at least not the way that web swinging, city exploration, basic combat, or the charming presentation of New York did after all these decades. The charm of helping citizens in random events, hearing Campbell's tips, delivering or destroying pizza so you can hear the music wind down, or even helping Robbie with the Daily Bugle photo ops was starting to wear off, and the novelty of replaying Spider-Man 2 20 years later was also starting to wear thin. The thing is though is that this was all due in part to that sense of bloat. It was actually easy to overlook some of the more graphical flaws that reflect on the limitations that Treyarch had to deal with in 2004. Even through emulation, certain assets still popped into the environment, whether it's during gameplay or during a cutscene. Character faces have that stretched Tony Hawk's Underground look, the hilarious inconsistencies between the in-game cinematics, which have Peter still using his glasses in his normal clothes for some reason, the CG cutscenes, which undoubtedly were handled by a completely different team, showed Doc Ock with a completely different Party City caliber costume at the end, and then there's the few moments where it seems like Spidey is blinking? Yeah, 2 decades later, and yet all of these technical mishaps are still forgivable because it's more difficult to ignore the filler material, the stuff that didn't age well, that likely someone behind the scenes, Activision, felt needed to be included. The hero point allocation system is not a technical glitch or bug. It's a fundamental design choice, and someone decided it needed to be there. And it's hard not to put on a tinfoil hat and speculate that this was a method to turn an originally 4-hour game and stretch it out to a full 8-hour title, just so that it can retail for the full price of $50 at the time of its release. And I cite this bloat as arguably the worst thing that has aged poorly about Spider-Man 2, the movie game, in the 20 years since. But as we all know, decisions like this, often involving prices and gamer retention and revenue, has shown to be a sort of mantra for Activision. Treyarch decided to bring a different sensibility of value to their 2004 follow-up, one that I didn't really appreciate enough as a kid, and I'd say is partially underrated by those who have played the game in droves all these years later, including myself. It's easy to grow embittered and look at many of the things that we loved as a kid and now renounce them due to either diminishing quality, growing tastes, or those things ending up being products of their time. But what Treyarch decided to focus on in Spider-Man 2 needs to be studied by current and future developers for action, superhero, and Spider-Man games. As 20 years later, not only are the more prolific aspects of the game like the web swinging have aged like fine wine, but aside from the new criticisms I've developed surrounding the padded point acquisition system, I discovered a new love and appreciation for some of the elements that I really wasn't looking at back in 2004. Replaying this as an adult is also realizing that this isn't just a movie tie-in game. It's practically an extension of the core film it's based on. Treyarch took chances on expanding the Spidey mythos within Sam Raimi's universe and decided to spin their own take on other Spidey comic-centered characters. Though I mentioned how basic his actual fight turned out to be, Rhino's visual design is actually rather cool, and voice acting legend John DiMaggio is obviously having fun with the role.
I've been dying to see what you can do. Let's go. Just try to break through my armor.
Quentin Beck / Mysterio's inclusion not only provides us with the excuse to visit the Statue of Liberty with this arcadey optical illusion gag, but you can tell that the devs were having fun designing this optical illusion, or the funhouse and clown enemies within Mysterio's House of Horrors. Though not every single creative endeavor aged the best. I love the idea of competing against Beck in Madison Square Garden, but dumping enemies in pits or navigating his obstacle course while dodging his electric cannon teetered on simply just being a minigame. And though it visually looks dynamic, fighting warped reflections of Spidey while trying to break all the mirrors got annoying fast as soon as these guys learned how to use their web and pull you away. Though these are all just minor tribulations that ended up being worth it, however, if it meant leading us to the best boss fight in the entire game, bar none. Yes, I still laughed.
Whoa, that was sick, dude. You rock so hard, Spidey.
Another sultry and potentially contested discovery after my recent playthrough was witnessing what I believe to be one of the best representations of Black Cat becoming realized in a movie tie-in game out of all places. As soon as she appears on the screen, you can tell that the devs were rather huge fans of her, and we're not talking about her claws. From her overall design to Holyfield's capturing her essence within her voice and making it sound very easy while also being paired with a very earwormy theme music. Her presence is immediately missed as her missions come to an end, and her chemistry with Tobey's Spider-Man whenever they share the screen is surprisingly compelling. In fact, unless my ears are failing me, it almost sounds like Tobey himself perks up his performance a bit whenever Cat is around. I mean, like she said, when she crosses your path, it's very difficult to keep her out of your head. It almost makes chasing Black Cat down during her missions worth the trouble. Yeah, these segments did grow a little tedious, and it was the only element I didn't really look forward to whenever she would purr right behind Spidey's shoulder. It didn't make matters better from a game design perspective to find out that nothing really happens if you get too far from her. She'll eventually just wait and make some kind of snarky remark, thus diminishing the sense of urgency. However, when you take a step back and look beyond the leathery outfit, you'll also notice why Black Cat is in the game to begin with. I realize now that she's more than just a reflection of the devs being a fan of the character, or simply just tossing it up as a fan service type of thing to Spidey comic purists. She is also a reflection of Spider-Man himself, thus proving to be this game's jab at one of the themes this game's cinematic counterpart tried to convey when it was released in theaters. In Sam Raimi's film, one of the big turning points is Peter choosing to live a normal life and renouncing his mantle as Spider-Man after failing to balance these two halves of his life. Since this is a topic that could be considered a little too introspective to fit into a movie tie-in video game, the developers made the bold and rather correct choice of weaving this existential dilemma Peter was facing into his and Black Cat's conversations throughout the latter missions of the game. They expand on his turmoils from the movie while not feeling terribly out of place or like the game kind of stops to deliver this message. It even teases at one of the big steps Spidey has contemplated not only in the comics or in the animated shows, but also in Raimi's own and rather flawed Spider-Man 3, stomping into the Bugle and tearing Jameson a new one after all the bad press. Though Cat was able to talk him out of it, it was also pretty fascinating to witness these layers being presented to me in this 20-year playthrough, and with new eyes to appreciate it more. Plus, Spidey can't really be getting his hands dirty right now, especially since he's got an 8-limbed mad scientist running rampant around New York City. And speaking of Doc Ock, the presentation of Doc's accident, while slightly rushed and somewhat comedic due to the aforementioned quality of the CG cutscenes, is also done a little bit more operatically and dramatically, heightened more by the use of the iconic Wilhelm scream.
Wait, a minor hiccup. Nothing to be alarmed about.
Minor hiccup? That dude is f***ing dead. The greatest highlight with the game's treatment of Doc Ock, however, comes in the form of Otto's scene with Kirk Connors after the off-screen hospital massacre. The movie is more than capable of filling in this macabre detail, but the game is able to ask a question we weren't really thinking about until now, or at least I wasn't. If Connors was such a friend of Otto's as he proclaimed both in the film and in the game, where was he when Otto had his accident? How did he react? Did Otto reach out to him? Did Kurt withdraw himself from the situation? It's not the deepest resolution, but the game offers this in-game cutscene that more or less answers some of these questions, by having Otto turn to Kurt in his time of need, only to be seduced by the arm's malevolent grasp. It is rather captivating and makes me wonder, where was this in the movie? The scene ends with Otto swearing his oath to rebuild the machine in the name of his late wife, Rosie, highlighting how much more codependent Otto is on Rosie than he is in his dream, making him more of a Frankenstein figure than the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde archetype that he was in the movie. The operatic nature of the character carries on even until his very end in the climax, even if it resulted in a jarring costume change like I mentioned before. One thing is consistent though, goofy hairdo, weird costume or not, Molina still nails it. After completing the main story of the game, an epilogue-style chapter begins with only one objective: acquire a whopping 50,000 hero points. Yes, I know, rather poetic, seeing as this was the only major gripe I had with the game looking back at it after 20 years. And the number the devs set here is so ridiculously high that they probably didn't expect too many players to complete it back in the day. Only those that loved the title that much, or were the most dedicated, or Spider-Man 2 the movie game was the only title that they could afford at the time. However, some of these devs may not have anticipated the concept of save states within emulators. And seeing as the main story had been completed, and I happen to have a nasty habit of letting curiosity get the better of me, I proceeded to complete this objective. Sure, it took adding a good half dozen hours to my playthrough, using some of these hero points to gain new abilities in the shop to make combat more fluid and speedier. There were also still more pizzas to be delivered, more photos to take for the Bugle, and even the combat arena to purchase and try out, leading to a secret boss that even I didn't bother myself with when I was 13 years old, and my attention span wasn't as strong then as it is now. It's been 20 years, and I couldn't think of a more perfect time for me to squeeze as much juice as possible out of this web-headed lemon. This meant acquiring as many upgrades as possible, picking up the golden tokens hiding throughout the city, stopping as many crimes as possible before I simply just could not take it anymore and had to move on. And just when the thought of calling it quits crossed my path, I did it. 50,000 hero points.
Wow, you did it. I can't believe it. I thought that last to-do list was impossible, but you actually managed it. Well, that's pretty much it. Swing around as much as you want. There's still lots of crimes to solve and places to explore. You can try and pick up any titles you haven't collected yet. Other than that, well, thanks for playing. See you next time.
And that is how special Spider-Man 2 the movie game really is. Yes, there have been objectively better Spider-Man games since, taking advantage of the technology and skill sets developers have been able to bring to the table, and my newfound criticisms of the game during this retrospective playthrough still stand. And I'm sure that some of these criticisms aren't even all that new, some of which were probably had by some older players who reviewed this back in 2004. But as seen in both the movie and the game, Spider-Man was never the best hero there is. He only strived to be a better Spider-Man than he was, either echoed by his talk with Black Cat, or resonating within the wise words of Aunt May in the film. Spider-Man 2, the 2004 movie game, is not the best Spider-Man game there is, but it is the better Spider-Man experience for many, and after 20 years, the most timeless for a select few, including me. Now, who wants pizza?